Recently, I've started to feel the need to begin collecting things, and if I wasn't enough of a hoarder as it is, I decided to collect old Nintendo 64 games still in the box. Did you know the Nintendo 64 had the official tagline of the fun machine? Yeah, I mean, I hope it's fun, but seriously, this is one of the weirdest taglines I've ever not noticed until today. Anyways, as I began working on my Nintendo 64 collection, I came across a copy of Donkey Kong 64 at a local game store, still in the box, and it was something I just couldn't pass up, especially since it has the reputation of being a legendary platformer developed by Rare, before this happened. Back in the day, Rare was known for revitalizing the character Donkey Kong into a widely popular series on the Super Nintendo that stood on its own completely and was almost known for being one of the best 2D platformers of its time, especially because of the graphical capabilities introduced that Rare utilized on the Super Nintendo. After the sequel, Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy Kong's Quest, Rareware began splitting up members from the Donkey Kong Country team into several different upcoming projects that they were planning on, which was kind of the standard in their studio with their releases. One group would go on to make Donkey Kong Country 3, which featured Dixie Kong and this one character that no one ever seems to remember. One group would go to work on an upcoming game known as Project Dream, which was aiming for an SNES release, which would incorporate graphical capabilities found in Donkey Kong Country, but also draw a lot of inspiration from JRPGs. And a third team would begin working on the early prototypes for a game that was known at the time as Conker's Quest. Interestingly enough though, out of these three projects, Conker's Quest was likely intended to be the first of these games to be released. However, director Chris Seaver had a lot of ideas of incorporating a ton of different genres into the game, and though we saw this game initially revealed all the way back in 1997, it wouldn't be until 2001 when the game would finally see an actual release. But as it turns out, this game was integral in allowing the Rareware team to try out different prototypes to better aim the development team as to what type of gameplay can actually be fun on various consoles. Meanwhile, at Rareware, Donkey Kong Country 3's development was moving along nicely as Rare already had 2 games under their belt, and it was looking like this game would see a release in a relatively short time frame from when the project began. However, the other team working on Project Dream was struggling along as developers were finding that ultimately, while they were having good ideas, the game wasn't up to the par that they had hoped for, and they began evolving the game more into a linear game, much like the Donkey Kong Country games. However, when Rare saw early footage of Mario 64 tied in with some of the prototypes that they were able to test around from their own upcoming Conker game, they knew that 3D platformers would not only be a hit, but also a defining genre of the generation. And Rare decided to repurpose their team and begin development on a 3D platformer, drawing elements from the canceled Dream project, and later Banjo-Kazooie was born. And as the development shifted on Project Dream, Rare was still able to release Donkey Kong Country 3 on time, and that team was ready to head into the next Donkey Kong game as per their contract deal with Nintendo. Since the development started after Banjo-Kazooie was already going, they were able to use the same engine that Banjo-Kazooie was using, and while early prototypes of Donkey Kong 64 were apparently similar in fashion to the Donkey Kong Country games, being more of a 2.5D side-scrolling platformer, seeing that Mario 64 had blew up in popularity as it was this really new and innovative way to play games, and Rare was really confident that Banjo-Kazooie would also be a success, development on Donkey Kong 64 actually pivoted again to be more of a 3D collectathon that we know today. Banjo-Kazooie would go ahead and release in 1998 to huge critical acclaim, and during all this, many members of the Banjo team would transition over to help finish up on Donkey Kong 64 and bring their expertise to the DK team on what they had learned from making Banjo-Kazooie, and they really were able to help expand on the game. And while Donkey Kong 64 was originally planned to release on the canceled Nintendo 64 DD in North America, they did have to rework parts of the game to fit on a regular cartridge. But since they were also trying to make a game that was a visual improvement from other games they've worked on the N64, high resolution textures and object distance were really important to Rare with this game, and essentially what ended up happening was a bug was found in the game that would not allow the game to function properly without a Nintendo 64 expansion pack. So ultimately, they decided to include an expansion pack in every copy of the game so that players can play the game the way that it was intended rather than having to buy an extra peripheral later on. This game actually ended up releasing in 1999 to critical acclaim. I mean, how could you go wrong with a game with a cast of characters that look like this? And it also helped that Nintendo had put a huge marketing budget playing commercials in movie theaters, on the radios, and they even put up billboards for Donkey Kong 64. This was like the Avengers of the late 90s, except they were monkeys and not superheroes. I wouldn't pick up this game for another year and a half or so after its release. And it wasn't until I was at a friend's house playing their Nintendo 64 that I was amazed that there were so many characters in one game. And my brother and I so desperately wanted this game. We immediately went and called our grandma and explained that we needed this game and that it was in a yellow cartridge. I was 6. She sent us Pokemon Yellow instead. That led to a whole different thing, but we had to call her back again and have her write down the name of the game this time, all without our mom ever knowing that we were secretly plotting to get our hands on that sweet copy of Donkey Kong 64. Either way, we got our copy and I remember playing the living daylights out of this game, but it was worth it. It wasn't until more recent years I began to see a ton of criticism for this game. Electronic Gaming Monthly said that as Super Mario 64 breathed life into the 3D platforming genre, Donkey Kong 64 sucked it all out and solidified Rare's reputation of only making collectathon games. Now, this wasn't just one-off conversation in the gaming community. Even the indie developer behind A Hat in Time, which is a fantastic game, has even blamed Donkey Kong 64 for the fact that collectathon platformer games have declined in popularity. The box art to this game shows all of the Kongs on a minecart and King K. Rool, I guess, in the background also on a minecart. And honestly, this is probably one of my favorite box arts for any Nintendo 64 game. The colors really pop, it looks like a good time, and I also like the way that the sides of this game look, showing off the various characters in different colors, and it's just kind of a neat aesthetic that kind of gets you excited for the game. The back of the box says, can Donkey Kong rescue his friends, reclaim the golden bananas, and save his homeland from certain doom? Take out some Kremlings with Chunky's pineapple launcher or Lanky's trombone. That's okay. Float through the air using Tiny's ponytail twirl, even rock to the sky with Diddy's jet barrel. I never knew that's what that was called, but I guess it's neat. I do find it interesting that they use Lanky's trombone as one of the biggest selling features of this game. Don't forget minigames, challenge a seal to race around the lagoon, go on a crazy minecart ride, and be on the lookout for a blast from the past. Then they talk about 4-player multiplayer split screen, and then they talk about the use of a required expansion pack, as if that was one of the coolest features. It's kind of more of a nuance if you rented this game and it didn't have the expansion pack with it. Well, I haven't played this game in a long time, and it's over 20 years old, so I guess we should take a look at it now and see how it holds up all these years later. Well, it's time for us to take a look if this game really deserves all of the hate that it gets nowadays. I am completely sold right now. Yeah, so for some reason at Rare, they thought that putting a Donkey Kong rap at the beginning of this game, introducing all of the characters, would be a way to get people excited for this game, and honestly, it's hilarious. I know some people really hated this, but I think it's just one of the funniest things that we've seen in a Nintendo game in a long time. I mean, it's catchy, it's really, really cringy, but it's kind of that good level of cringe that you want to inject right into your bloodstream. And hey, at least you learn about each member in the game, and it gives you something to look forward to as to what power-ups and abilities these characters have. Of course, you could always read the manual, which details the characters some more, but reading is way too much work when you can just listen to an awesome rap song. It's a good way to reach those kids in the 90s. I mean, this is relatable, right? I mean, at least we learn a bit about these characters' abilities, like Donkey Kong is just kind of the standard all-around character, Diddy Kong is cool, and he gets a jetpack. Tiny Kong can shrink and fly through the air, kind of like Dixie Kong from Donkey Kong Country 2, and Lanky Kong is weird. And then there's Chunky Kong, who is this awkward, big, and slow character, but packs a punch. I mean, this rap is as 90s as it gets, and I love it. As we start up a file and jump into the story for the first time, King K. Rool is up to his shenanigans again. His ship breaks down right in front of Donkey Kong Island, which looks like Donkey Kong's head. I never understood that as a kid. But oh no! All of Donkey Kong's friends are captured. We have to save them and stop King K. Rool from vaporizing the island or something. Yeah. And upon starting the game, you can only play as a Donkey Kong, and you'll have to go and save all of Donkey Kong's friends, and then you can play as them, because it just can't be easy from the beginning. As Donkey Kong's adventure begins, he has to do some training, tutorial exercises, and the game starts us right off the gate introducing us to one of these concepts where we have to go to a vendor to get special power-ups. In this case, it's Cranky Kong who gives us the ability to ground pound, but we're gonna see a lot of having to stop by vendors throughout this game. We finally leave the open area and we kind of enter this central hub area with a bunch of platforms with numbers on them. Now if you don't know what these are for, it's okay because it's super obvious. Banana porting. The first thing that obviously comes to anyone's mind. Essentially, along every world in Donkey Kong 64, there's these platforms numbered throughout, and if you find 2 of these same numbered platforms, you can use the platforms to teleport to the other one by a banana. It's actually a pretty useful tool to get around quickly, even though you have to go and activate both nodes first. Anyway, so once we're cut loose from Cranky, we actually make our way over to this big jail cell and meet K. Lumsy, who wants to help us defeat K. Rool, but since he's locked up, we have to get all of the keys to open up the door for him. The only way we get the keys are by beating bosses, and in return for us beating the bosses, he'll do a little dance that opens up worlds for us to go and explore. It's a pretty symbiotic relationship. However, even though he opens up doors for you, the other character, B. Locker, won't let you in unless you have enough golden bananas, pretty much just incentivizing you to do the extra quests to get the golden bananas, kind of the equivalent of Jiggies from Banjo-Kazooie. And you better have enough, or else you're going back to the last world you've been in and have to grind for more golden bananas because this guy ain't letting you in. Alright, so now we're getting into the actual meat of the game, and we're in the first world, known as Jungle Japes. It's a forest area, and it's pretty good for getting your footing down as a newer player in this game. There's these weird chipmunk looking things that look interesting in 3D and make an annoying noise. Our boy Diddy Kong is stuck on this level, and we have to go and save him too. But the only way I can save him is by shooting 3 targets on the map, and since I don't have a gun, I need to go and recruit the help of Funky Kong so I can get a gun from him. But to get a gun, I also have to get coins to buy the gun, and you can see where this can kind of get tedious for some players, constantly having a long list of errands just to do a simple task. Fortunately, I already had coins, so I was able to get the gun, and this would be something I'll have to come back and do for each character, along with spending coins to get various power-ups along the way. Sure, it would have been nice if each character just kind of shared a wallet and bought stuff for each other, but that's not how economy works in this game, so we have to go and collect money individually as each character along the way. Fortunately enough though, typically there's character changing barrels spread out throughout the levels relatively easily where you can usually find one without too much backtracking, so it's not as bad as a lot of people kind of make it out to be. I go on, I shoot the 3 targets, and one of them is actually outside of the game's render distance, so I had to find a different angle to hit it. And while I was searching for these buttons to save Diddy Kong with, I found another vendor who wants me to collect secret blueprints in exchange for a golden banana. His name's Snide, and it's just another thing to collect. Either way, I went ahead and saved Diddy Kong, and now he's officially joined the squad. He becomes a playable character, and he can do things and pick up things that other characters cannot, like red bananas and red coins and whatnot. He has a unique moveset, he's much lighter than Donkey Kong, and a little bit faster, and he fights in his own way. But ultimately, besides just collecting golden bananas and getting our friends unlocked, we have to make sure we're getting those boss keys also if we want to get into the other worlds. You see, in each world there's a boss which can only be opened by feeding a hippo enough bananas in hopes to make him fat enough so that he can jump on a scale and this pig can reach the key. Why they don't just switch platforms to save us all this time, I'll never know, but each character must go into the world and collect bananas of their assigned color and then feed them to the hippo before the boss battle can become unlocked. And honestly, I have to say I love the way that this game handles the bosses. Instead of just running into them like you do in other 3D platformers, they really took some time to make a spectacle out of it. The faces showing on the door before it opens, the door slowly and magnificently opening with the lights going out and the sparkles going with ominous music. It's a really cool experience, and you know, it kind of gets you hyped to jump into this game, and this is one of the things that this game does really, really well. I enter, the doors shut behind me, let's go. It is time for our first boss fight. And honestly, Rare didn't even skip out on the bosses either. I mean, look at this first boss. Sure, it's not a difficult boss, it's the entry-level boss of the game, but they give you this heightened sense of having a damage phase and having this large encounter that makes you feel really accomplished once you actually figure out how to defeat the boss. This one wasn't too hard by any means, and we finally get our key, and we're kind of starting to get a hang of this game at this point. We're now ready to take this back to Clumsy, who will unlock another world for us to go into, but before we do that, I run into a slightly bigger enemy with Diddy Kong. The red hair indicates that it needs to be an enemy that's defeated by Diddy Kong. He drops a blueprint, which I go on to take to Snide, and he gives you a golden banana. And that's just kind of another collectible you have to get along the way as well. At least it helps you obtain more golden bananas, which helps you get into worlds a little bit easier. Clumsy opens up the next world for us, and now we are onward to Angry Aztec. All levels follow the same general formula as others, where you have to get a power-up for each character, use that to access new areas to collect more bananas, which you use to get into more boss fights, and those boss fights give you keys that can give you access to new worlds. This level is more of an Egyptian desert theme, which actually houses two unlockable characters this time around, Tiny Kong and Lanky Kong. Diddy has to save Tiny by using a new headbutt ability and this tricky platforming thing, then he has to swim underwater and headbutt more letters in a specific order to move his way through and save Tiny Kong. Seriously, this stuff doesn't mess around here. As a kid, my brother and I, who had gotten this game, had to recruit our even older brother, who was already an adult and had moved out of the house, to come back home to help us figure out how to unlock Tiny Kong. This stuff probably was way too important to us as a kid, but hey, we got Tiny Kong unlocked. Then on the other hand, Donkey Kong is the one who goes and saves Lanky Kong, and if you thought saving Tiny Kong was hard, look at this. All you have to do is press a button right next to the door. Okay. These two characters are quite unique, as Tiny Kong can fly and Lanky Kong can climb up inclines with his hands, kind of like Kazooie's ability in Banjo-Kazooie. This level also introduces musical instruments, just an item that kills most enemies in close proximity and can be used on music pads to do something special, and this makes me uncomfortable. I don't know, this character always just kind of freaked me out a little bit as a kid. Also, the introduction of mini games that serve a way to get golden bananas is much more prevalent here. Sure, there's a couple mini games on the previous levels, but right here, it's pretty intense. But the weird thing about this level is it definitely ramps up the difficulty significantly, as by now you should be getting a hang of things, and there are more characters, meaning more bananas for the boss, and this time around, it's Diddy Kong's turn to fight off the boss. Looks like he has to fight a dragonfly boss? Man, Diddy just murdered that thing's kid. Wow. This boss is actually pretty cool, even if it's just a slightly faster and flying version of the last boss. The creativeness between these two bosses and what we've seen so far has been really awesome. This time, after defeating the boss, Clumsy actually opens up two worlds, but we only have enough golden bananas to go to the first one, which is this Toyland Workshop type world. And honestly, I really like the aesthetic on this level. So many games have done the whole factory, evil, corporation type world, and it's really clever how they actually incorporated elements of this level into not only the enemies, but they kind of tried to expand it more and make it more of this toy workshop with some Santa Claus type themes to it. I don't know. The level isn't really the greatest level, but aesthetically speaking, it's nice to kind of run around on. On this level, we save Chunky Kong here, completing the team once and for all, and now we get to switch and try out all of the characters. And now that we have a full team, there's definitely the opportunity for a lot of backtracking, as we're gonna have to run back and forth to pick up bananas for the corresponding characters. However, my strategy going into this is just to run through the map as one character one by one, rather than running back and forth and constantly switching, and it seems to actually flow relatively easily. Speaking of a lot of characters, this game also had a multiplayer mode, and I know we're kind of getting off topic a little bit, but I just thought this would be the best place to fit this in, since we're not going to talk about it too much, as I never really played it that much as a kid. But what I did play, I remember it being okay. Like, it was a cool feature to have, and you could play between all of the characters and switch off, which was cool. And there was a sixth character, which was pretty much just a clone of Chunky, and it was kind of neat. But I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, there was a multiplayer, but instead we're still here in this toy shop looking for bananas to get. One really cool thing though, as you progress later on the level, the golden bananas are a little more challenging than before, but because of that, we have more unique ways of getting them, either doing some sort of mini game in a neat way, doing some sort of puzzle like Donkey Kong has to do here, where he ground pounds the numbers in a timed sequence. I thought it was really cool that this game even put an entire arcade cabinet that Donkey Kong can play, where you can play the original arcade version of Donkey Kong, and that was so mind-blowing as a kid. I remember our older brother coming over to show us that this is what games were like back in the day, and we thought that was primitive. Honestly, we couldn't fathom how people found entertainment out of these type of low graphic games, because we were used to these high quality Donkey Kong graphics. Well, after grinding more bananas, we finally go into the boss fight, and honestly, this one is insanely terrifying and actually quite challenging. Seriously, I never got too much further than this world in Donkey Kong 64 as a kid, because this thing was nightmare fuel for me, and it was terrifying. But honestly, this boss fight is one of the more challenging ones, as you have to fly as Tiny Kong platform to platform and quickly figure out which platform the giant jack-in-the-box looking thing is, and ground pound the corresponding switch that is for him and not accidentally hit the wrong one. And it isn't one of those easy boss fights where there's just 3 rounds of doing it. You have to do this multiple times, way more than 3 times, and the thing gets faster, it gets invisible, it shoots lasers at you. It is really intense, and fortunately we somehow were able to beat it here. So I guess it's time to move on to the water level, and honestly I typically hate water levels in games, but this one does it relatively well. It helps that you don't have a limited amount of breath. Apparently monkeys are amphibious creatures, which is actually a mechanic I prefer here rather than Banjo-Kazooie or even Mario 64. By the way, the music in this level, let alone the entire game, is absolutely beautiful, but this level really underlines how great the soundtrack has been so far. Grant Kirkhope is known for doing the music for these types of games and a ton of games in the rare glory days, and honestly it just really shows here. They definitely build a great atmosphere, and while I do think I probably prefer the Banjo-Kazooie soundtrack a little bit more, this game does a good job at balancing some traditional music from the Donkey Kong Country games and kind of tie them into the Donkey Kong Country soundtrack that really was so ethereal back in the day. It's really a nice touch how the instruments and the tempo will actually change based on whether you're inside or outside or underwater, while also keeping the same melody through and through, which keeps the level relatively thematic all the way across, and it's just that extra level of polish that I really appreciate. I will say I'm not a fan of the music on Angry Aztec though. It just feels like a fever dream, and ugh. Okay, the one thing though that I definitely have to point out here, while I feel like the levels as we progress are getting better and better, the teleportation system seems to be getting progressively worse. In the first couple of levels, most of the teleporters are clustered in the same general area, so then you just go to the corresponding number of where you want to go to. However, in this level and later levels, it seems like they spread the teleporters out, and it makes it extremely difficult to try to figure out where each teleporter actually takes you, and a lot of the time I'm just guessing where the teleporter goes and just hope it takes me to the right area, and a lot of the times I would get lost in the process to the point where I just stopped using teleporters altogether because they're not really functionable here. I really started having the frustration in the previous world, but it definitely carries over here, and it only gets worse as we go along. But I do have to say, this level is really nice. There's a really cool callback to Donkey Kong Country 2 where you're swimming in some shipwrecked boats, and the swimming mechanics can be a little bit frustrating at times to see exactly where you are, but it's never completely awful. Also, I really like the water raising mechanic that is apparent in this level, as it just kind of changes up your access to certain areas, and it makes you feel like you accomplished something when you actually raise the water level here. They easily could have just slapped this level in the game to make it longer, but it actually feels like they put a lot of thought into developing every part of this level and make it more fluid than just a level with water in it, and I appreciate that. The boss fight on this level has us playing as Lanky Kong this time around, and instead of just getting to play as Lanky Kong, we actually are in a boat, and that's kind of cool. This one has us driving a boat around, activating these electric pillars to take out the boss, and it's really cool, but it gets progressively harder as you have to go faster and really find these targets immediately. It might not have been as hard as the previous boss, but it definitely kept the challenge up while also being really fun to play on. Next, we're going into Fungi Forest, forest, and it's this beautiful day and night map that was actually cut from Banjo-Kazooie, which means this level was probably added in a little bit later in development as the Banjo-Kazooie team was now helping out, and we need to get 300 bananas for a boss fight? Jeez. Well, it looks like we'll be here for a while, and at least we can explore the area, and honestly, this map is pretty nice. It's a very open area, and it's really cool that you can change the map to nighttime, which is really cool. It actually gives you access to certain areas depending whether it's day or night, and while it's very similar in the sense of raising the water level in the last level, this kind of serves as a precursor to the day and night cycle that we see in a lot of games today. With this level opening up new areas when you switch it to night, it definitely adds to a lot of the backtracking, which I feel like here it's almost the point of the game. Like, this game, while it is a 3D platformer, it almost acts as a collectathon with a bunch of switches along the way. Set something up like so, go here as this character to do this, allowing this character to receive the golden banana, which does this for your overall progression, and it's this formula of having to constantly check boxes to get progress through the game. It's a pretty big departure from what we've seen in other platformers, but this is kind of a new approach to the genre, and it's doing something really on its own rather than being a sequel to Banjo-Kazooie per se. I feel like a lot of people liked the different characters, different objectives, and switching between the characters, and a lot of criticism is made on the backtracking elements, and I can agree to an extent, but it's not as exaggerated as a lot of the critics make it out to be. Sure, some things could be sped along, like teleporter placement, but I actually like having to go to a specific barrel to change out characters and make it feel like it's a new experience or a different experience every time I run through different sections of the level as each character. Also, here's a list of popular Nintendo 64 games that also had some level of backtracking or revisiting areas. Yeah, literally everything. But damn, if this game's gonna be the definition of a collectathon, there are a lot of things that we get to collect along the way. Coins, bananas, golden bananas, banana medals, blueprints, boss keys, and we can't forget about the inventory items like grenades, bullets, power-up crystals, and music headphones. Also, there's this fairy who wants our help because she can't find all of her other fairies, and she wants us to run around picking up film for your camera so you can take pictures of the fairies to prove that they're still alive and well. I don't plan on taking any pictures of fairies to prove that they're alive and well. So yeah, if you're into collectathons, there's a lot to collect-a-thon. I do have to say though, the world building here is really unique, and there's a big emphasis on puzzles and mini-games and rewards for completing those puzzles and mini-games, which is really nice. It almost makes enemies in this game feel unwarranted or unneeded, as I want to go do what I gotta do, more so than stopping around and fighting things like a regular action 3D platformer would have you do. I kind of find myself just running past enemies most of the time because I just want to go do my thing. And while people criticize these characters making the game slower, I really like the various characters and their abilities. I love the dynamics between Tiny shrinking and Chunky getting large, Lanky being weird, and Diddy Kong always having the coolest stuff out of the bunch. And then there's Donkey Kong, he's in the game too. I mean, look how awesome this kart racing thing is. There's something unique like this in every world, and it's awesome. Sure, opening a door just to see a path of bananas for the other character is kind of annoying, but it's not earth-shattering here. And the boss fights have been pretty epic and unique every single time we've jumped into it. I mean, there aren't even two bosses that share any similarities. Okay, it looks like this boss is just a rehash of Diddy Kong's boss, except we get punched in the face. Well, everything else I said had some sort of level of validity, didn't it? After we finished up this level, we can go on to Crystal Caves, and this world is also inspired by a cut banjo content, which kind of reaffirms that these later levels were added in later. And as we go along, I'm starting to realize that these later levels in the game play way better than the earlier ones. Sure, Jungle Japes was fun, but Angry Aztec was really not fun. I just can't get behind this level. The quicksand is really counterintuitive, especially since it's only the second world. There were so many times where I would just jump in quicksand and get injured and just try to jump through it to get over it. And the third world, like I said earlier, while the aesthetic's pretty cool, it definitely feels cluttered and it's easy to get lost. But at this point, we've been having some really cool levels, from the banger water level, the awesome forest level, and now we have caves. Yeah, the caves might not be as exciting as the previous levels, but this being the 6th world, it is kind of easy to navigate, and it's easy to at least tell what I'm doing and where I'm going, rather than just wandering around on a level like the Third World's factory level. Also, this level has a cool racing part. It's stupidly hard, but neat. As we get to the boss fight here, this time as we approach the boss fight, we cycle back to Donkey Kong as every character has now fought a boss, and this time we have another rehashed boss from the first world, except he's a little bit harder. I mean, this boss fight's cool, it's still okay, and it's the last reused boss, so I will try not to complain too much. We're approaching the end game of this saga, and we are now going on to Creepy Castle, and this is kind of the last regular level in the game, and we need 400 bananas. Hello? I do have to say, this is actually probably one of the more underrated spooky levels in a Nintendo game. I mean, there's catacombs, the castle is huge, and there's a lot of places we can go, and we can even make our way all the way up to the top. Sometimes it can get a little bit tricky navigating our way up the castle, especially with the old N64 camera, but it's not really as bad as people probably make this one out to be. Using the C buttons really helps move the camera around, and using the right trigger just snaps the camera behind me at most instances. So really there's only a couple of places through this entire run where I've run into trouble, and since this game doesn't emphasize pinpoint accuracy as much as Mario 64 would, it's pretty forgiving at times. This boss fight is actually a really interesting idea where we have to kind of fight a cutout version of King K. Rool. It kind of is foreshadowing the epic battle we'll inevitably have once we get there at the end of the game, and on this one we can actually use whichever character we want, which is a first. At least it's not a reused boss fight, and this one has some hilarious sound effects. I mean, listen to this. Alright, and after all of that, we're in the final stretch going to the last world, which is Hideout Helm. Now this level is cool because instead of the typical world where I'd have to run around looking for bananas forever, this is actually a timed level where you have to use all of the skills that each Kong has acquired throughout the game to get through it in a limited amount of time. Now the timer isn't too harsh, pretty sure anyone can get through it, but it is really cool that you have to use your knowledge and things you've learned along the way to really prove yourself here. It is really cool to see areas from cutscenes, and getting to disable the machine that Snide had us out collecting blueprints for this entire run is actually really cool. And then finally, after making it through this last level, you can't get into the last area without having these 2 tokens. What? Yeah, so for whatever reason, Rareware, when making this game, decided if you want to open this door, you need to get these 2 tokens that are only acquired by getting the high enough score in the 2 hidden arcade games that we hid in Donkey Kong 64. You know, honestly, I thought these were just cool Easter eggs, but apparently it's required. I hope you're good at Donkey Kong and Jetpack, because now you have to do well enough to actually beat this game. And imagine going through a huge adventure across the sea, deserts, forests, caves, a house, only to fail because you didn't get the high enough score in a retro arcade game. I'm actually triggered right now. Okay, so we need to play Jetpack and Donkey Kong. So bada bing, bada boom, 3 hours later we did it. Now we're able to go back through, get the key, let Kalumsy out, and we are going on to this final epic battle. I'm so excited to see what it is. It's a YouTuber boxing match. Alright. Honestly, out of all of the boss fights we've seen so far, this was not at all what I was expecting. I seriously thought it would be this big ultimate battle mimicking the intensity that was all of the main boss fights we had so far. It's a little goofy, but it's still really cool how each character gets their own round and uses something from the arsenal and abilities that they've gained over the course of the run to contribute to the fight, like Tiny jumping in the shoe or Lanky stretching his arms out of the arena. And finally, with a final fight, we get Chunky to do the final blow, who's this character that's kind of a coward all the way through, and it's cool that he's the one that finishes off King K. Rool once and for all, and that's the game. Sure, we didn't 101% this game, maybe I'll get on that later, but man, this game is really filled to the brim with content, and despite my few gripes, I think this game doesn't get the love it really deserves. It's the full package, and one that I really appreciate. And sure, other people who have made their criticisms along the way are entitled to their own opinion, but I really wish more people would maybe look at Donkey Kong 64 as a 3D collectathon in its own right, rather than the 3D platformer adventure collectathon other games like Donkey Kong 64 and Mario 64 had. This game was really focused on the collecting aspect rather than the platforming that those other games are known for, and I I think that it just too often gets thrown into the same level of comparison as those other games. But this is definitely one of the most satisfying games to complete, and it just feels so good once you've finally accomplished it. And look, there's even a credit scene that shows you some of the characters. Oh god, no.